The summer of 1851 descended upon Vicksburg, Mississippi like a funeral shroud, heavy, suffocating, and thick with the scent of magnolia blossoms rotting on the vine. Clara Whitlock stood at the second-floor window of the big house, her pale fingers pressed against the glass, watching the field hands move in synchronized misery beneath the merciless sun. From this height, they looked like chess pieces her father manipulated with invisible strings. Colonel Edmund Whitlock ruled his plantation with the precision of a military campaign and the cruelty of a man who believed God had personally commissioned his dominion. Every Sunday he read scripture at breakfast, his voice booming through the dining room about duty, order, and the divine hierarchy that placed white men at the apex of creation. Clara had learned long ago to keep her eyes on her plate, to nod at the appropriate moments, to be the perfect ornament her mother had been before consumption took her 7 years prior. Clara, tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. Her father's voice echoed up the mahogany staircase. Stop daydreaming and come practice your needlework. Mrs. Pemberton will be here this afternoon, and I won't have her thinking I've raised an idle girl. She descended slowly, her silk dress rustling against the banister. The house smelled of beeswax and tobacco, of wealth built on suffering. In the parlor, her embroidery hoop waited like a small torture device. She had been working on the same pastoral scene for 3 months, shepherds and lambs in an idealized countryside that bore no resemblance to the blood-soaked reality beyond the veranda. The afternoon dragged, with Mrs. Pemberton's tedious gossip about engagements, scandals, and the upcoming harvest ball. The woman's voice was a mosquito whine, and Clara found herself nodding mechanically while her mind wandered to the stables, to the leather-bound book she'd hidden there 2 nights ago, tucked between hay bales where no one would think to look. When twilight finally painted the sky in shades of amber and ash, Clara excused herself, claiming a headache. Her father barely looked up from his ledgers, those meticulous records of human property catalogued like livestock. She climbed the stairs to her room, waited until she heard his study door close, then slipped out through the servants' entrance. The path to the stables was worn smooth by decades of boots. The air had cooled slightly, bringing with it the mingled scents of honeysuckle and manure, sweetness and decay existing side by side as they did in everything here. Cicadas screamed their nightly chorus, a sound so constant it became a kind of silence. The stable door creaked as she pushed it open. Inside, horses shifted in their stalls, huffing softly. A single lantern burned in the back corner, its light catching on the face of the man who stood there, waiting, Josiah. He was tall, with hands that knew both gentleness and hard labor. His skin was dark as river clay, and his eyes held an intelligence that terrified the overseers. Unlike the other slaves, Josiah could read and write, a secret his previous master had foolishly taught him, believing a literate slave made a better bookkeeper. When that master died in a card game, Josiah became Colonel Whitlock's property, assigned to manage the stables because the colonel appreciated efficiency and loathed waste. Miss Clara, he said quietly, not quite meeting her eyes. Even here, in this stolen moment, the weight of Southern law hung between them like an invisible noose. I brought another book, she said, pulling the volume from beneath her shawl. It was Douglas's narrative, smuggled from a traveling bookseller in Memphis who'd been too drunk to ask questions. Have you finished the last one? Josiah nodded slowly. I have. Though I'm not sure I should be reading such things, miss. If the colonel— My father, Clara interrupted, believes books are wasted on women and dangerous for slaves. That alone tells me they're the most important things in the world. A ghost of a smile touched Josiah's lips. For months now, they had met like this, at first by accident when Clara had come to check on her mare and found Josiah reading by lantern light, his lips moving silently over the words. She'd been taught to see slaves as property, as less than human, But in that moment, she'd seen only a man desperate for knowledge in a world designed to keep him ignorant. That first night, she'd asked what he was reading. He'd been terrified, certain she would report him. Instead, she'd sat down in the hay and asked him to read aloud. His voice had trembled at first, then grown stronger, and she'd heard in his words a longing that mirrored her own. To understand, to think, to be more than what others had decided they should be. Now, weeks later, their meetings had become routine. Dangerous, seditious, unthinkable routine. They sat in the hay, and Josiah opened the book carefully, reverently. As he read, Clara watched his face transform. Here, in this lamplight, the masks they both wore fell away. He wasn't property, and she wasn't the Colonel's daughter. They were simply two people sharing words in the darkness. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Clara asked when he paused. "Running north?" Josiah's jaw tightened. "Every day, miss. But it's not just me. I have a sister in the quarters and a nephew who's only 6. The Underground Railroad don't take everyone, and if I ran alone—" Bish, he didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what happened to the families of runaways. "There has to be another way," Clara said, more to herself than to him. "This can't be right. It can't be God's will, no matter what my father preaches." "Begging your pardon, miss, but your father's God seems mighty fond of keeping people in chains." Clara looked up sharply, expecting to see mockery or anger. Instead, she saw only exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of a man forced to pretend gratitude for his own oppression. "Then maybe," she said slowly, "we need to find a different God." Josiah stared at her, something shifting in his expression. Hope, perhaps, or the dangerous beginning of it. They talked until the lantern oil ran low, their voices hushed beneath the sound of horses breathing and the endless Mississippi night pressing in from all sides. They spoke of freedom and philosophy, of the cruelty masquerading as civilization, of the terrible mathematics that calculated human worth in dollars and cents. When Clara finally rose to leave, Josiah stood as well. "Miss Clara," he said, "you should stop coming here. If anyone saw—" "Let them see," she said, surprised by the fierceness in her own voice. "I'm tired of being afraid of my father's world." As she slipped back toward the house, the moon hung low and swollen over the cotton fields. In the slave quarters, someone was singing, a low, mournful melody that spoke of rivers and promised lands, of suffering that had no end in sight. Inside the big house, her father's study light still burned. Clara paused in the hallway, listening to him move about, probably reviewing his ledgers, counting his wealth in flesh and bone. She climbed the stairs to her room, her heart pounding with something that might have been fear or might have been its opposite. Change was coming to Whitlock Plantation, gathering like a storm on the horizon. She could feel it in her bones, in the way the very air seemed charged with possibility and danger. That night, she dreamed of burning fields and open gates, of chains falling away like dead skin. She dreamed of her father's face, purple with rage, and of Josiah's hands, reaching toward freedom. She didn't know then that in less than a month, both dreams would come true in ways she couldn't imagine. She didn't know that her father's heart would betray him just as he'd betrayed every principle of human decency. She didn't know that she would stand before that open gate, her signature still wet on documents that would make her either a hero or a pariah. All she knew was that the pretending was over. The perfect daughter was dying, and in her place, someone dangerous was being born. Someone who understood that some inheritances were meant to be destroyed. The August heat turned Vicksburg into a furnace where even thoughts seemed to wilt. Clara woke each morning to find her sheets damp with sweat, her dreams fragmenting like glass the moment consciousness returned. But despite the oppressive climate, she found herself counting the hours until nightfall, when she could slip away to the stables where Josiah waited with books and truths her father had spent her entire life hiding. Their meetings grew bolder. What had begun as furtive conversations lasting mere minutes now stretched into hours. Josiah brought her accounts from other slaves, stories the colonel's careful propaganda machine had never allowed her to hear. Sarah, who'd been sold away from her children 3 times. Old Moses, whose back was a map of scars from 20 years of whippings. Ruth, who'd watched overseers violate her daughter and been beaten for trying to intervene. Clara listened with growing horror, each story peeling away another layer of the comfortable lie she'd been raised inside. Her father's world, the world of cotillions and calling cards, of scripture readings and Sunday socials, was built on a foundation of suffering so immense she couldn't comprehend its edges. "How do you bear it?" she asked Josiah one night as they sat in the hay, the lantern burning low between them. "Knowing that tomorrow you'll wake up in chains again." Josiah was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the spine of a worn Bible. "You find small freedoms, miss. A moment of dignity here, a secret kept there. You remember you're human, even when everyone's trying to convince you otherwise." He looked up, his eyes reflecting lantern light. "And sometimes, if you're lucky, you meet someone who reminds you that not everyone believes the lie." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning Clara was only beginning to understand. She was falling in love, not with Josiah himself perhaps, but with what he represented. The possibility that the world she'd inherited wasn't fixed, wasn't inevitable, wasn't right. But understanding came with a price. Every breakfast with her father became an exercise in suppressed rage. When he read scripture about slaves obeying their masters, she bit her tongue until she tasted blood. When he complained about lazy field hands, she thought of Sarah's calloused hands and Moses's broken back. The distance between them grew wider each day, a chasm her father couldn't see because he'd never bothered to look at her as anything more than an ornamental extension of his will. On the 3rd Wednesday of August, Clara's world shifted again. She'd gone to the stables earlier than usual, carrying a basket of food she'd stolen from the kitchen. The cook, Mama Bess, had watched her take cornbread and salted pork without saying a word, but Clara had seen the knowledge in the old woman's eyes. The slaves knew. Of course they knew. Nothing happened on a plantation without the people who actually worked it being aware. Josiah wasn't alone when she arrived. A young man stood with him, thin, barely 20, with eyes that darted like a cornered animal's. Clara recognized him as Daniel, one of the field hands. "Miss Clara," Josiah said carefully, "Daniel has something to tell you, something you need to hear." Daniel wouldn't meet her eyes. His hands shook as he spoke, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "They gonna sell my wife, miss. The colonel, he told Overseer Matthews to take her to the auction block in Natchez next week. Said she's been too sickly, not worth keeping." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She'd seen the woman, Hannah, her name was Hannah, working in the vegetable garden just that morning. "She's pregnant," Clara whispered. "Yes, 5 months along, but that don't matter to the colonel. He already got the papers drawn up." The basket slipped from Clara's hands. This was different from stories told in lamplight. This was happening now, tomorrow, to real people whose names she knew. "Why are you telling me this?" Daniel finally looked at her, and what she saw in his expression made her stomach turn. Hope. Desperate, foolish hope that she, the colonel's daughter, might have some power to intervene. "Josiah said you were different," Daniel said. "Said you understood. I know I got no right to ask, miss, but if you could talk to your father, maybe—" "He won't listen to me," Clara said, her voice hollow. "I'm just a woman. Less than property in his eyes, just better dressed." "Then we're all damned," Daniel said flatly. He turned to go, but Josiah caught his arm. "Wait!" Josiah looked at Clara, something urgent burning in his gaze. What if there was another way? Not asking, not begging. What if we just took her? The stable seemed to contract around them. "You're talking about running," Clara said. "I'm talking about saving a life, getting Hannah and Daniel north before the auction. It's been done before." "The railroad," would get you all killed, Clara interrupted. The patrollers, the dogs, my father's connections in every county between here and Memphis. You wouldn't make it 20 miles. Then we die trying, Daniel said with a terrible calm. Better than watching them take her, watching our baby get sold off soon as it's born. Clara's mind raced. She thought of the small iron box in her father's study, where he kept cash for household expenses. She thought of the horses in their stalls, fast and well-fed. She thought of the maps in the library, showing roads north through Tennessee and Kentucky. How much time do we have? She heard herself asking. Josiah's eyes widened. Miss Clara, you can't... How much time? 6 days, the auction's next Tuesday. Clara nodded slowly, feeling something shift inside her, some final boundary dissolving. She'd been educated in needlework and French, in how to pour tea and when to smile. But Josiah had educated her in something more dangerous, conscience. Then we have 6 days to plan, she said. Meet me tomorrow night, and bring Hannah. If we're going to do this, she needs to be part of the decision. That night, Clara lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling where moonlight painted shifting shadows. Below her, the plantation slept, her father dreaming whatever dreams tyrants dream, the overseer in his cottage, the slaves in their quarters. An entire world built on violence, pretending to be order. She rose and went to her window, looking out over the fields. Somewhere out there, Hannah and Daniel held each other, counting down their final days together. Somewhere, Josiah sat awake, probably wondering if the white girl in the big house would actually follow through, or if this was just another cruelty, hope offered and then snatched away. Clara pressed her forehead against the glass, feeling its coolness against her skin. She thought about her mother, dead these 7 years, and wondered what the woman would think of her daughter now. Would she be horrified, proud, or would she simply not understand, having lived and died within the same comfortable lie? In the slave quarters, someone began to sing. That same mournful melody Clara heard most nights, the one about rivers and freedom. She'd asked Josiah what the words meant, and he'd told her it wasn't about meaning, but about survival. How do you endure the unendurable? You sing. You remember that suffering isn't forever, even when it feels eternal. Clara began to hum along softly, her breath fogging the window. She was standing at a precipice, and once she stepped off, there would be no going back. She would become an enemy of her father's world, a traitor to her race and class. The women who took tea in her parlor would spit at the mention of her name. But Hannah would live. Her baby would be born free, and maybe that was all the inheritance that mattered. The next morning at breakfast, Colonel Whitlock read from Ephesians, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ." Clara set down her fork very precisely. "Father," she said, "what if Paul was wrong?" The colonel looked up, his expression hovering between confusion and irritation. "Wrong? Scripture is divinely inspired, Clara. It cannot be wrong. But it was written by men, translated by men, interpreted by men who benefit from its interpretation." Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "What if we've been reading it wrong all along?" Her father's face darkened. "We will discuss your religious education later. Eat your breakfast." Clara picked up her fork, but didn't eat. Across the table, her father returned to his papers, already dismissing her question as feminine hysteria or some other convenient excuse. He didn't see the danger sitting across from him. He never had. That night in the stables, Clara met with Josiah, Hannah, and Daniel. Hannah was small and slight, her pregnancy barely showing beneath her plain dress. When Clara handed her the food basket, the woman's hands trembled. "Thank you, miss," Hannah whispered. "Whatever happens, thank you for seeing us." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "We're going to get you out," she promised. "I don't know exactly how yet, but we will." They huddled together in the lamplight, 4 conspirators planning treason against everything the Mississippi Delta held sacred. Josiah had connections to the railroad through a freed man in Vicksburg who sometimes delivered supplies to the plantation. Clara had access to money and horses. Daniel knew the patrol routes. Hannah knew which roads to avoid. As dawn approached and they separated, Clara felt a strange lightness for the first time in her life. She wasn't playing a role. She wasn't the colonel's perfect daughter or the future wife of some plantation heir. She was simply herself, flawed, afraid, but finally awake. Walking back to the house, she passed the family chapel, its white paint glowing in the pre-dawn light. Inside, her ancestors were buried, generations of Whitlocks who'd built their fortune on stolen labor and called it God's will. Clara paused at the door, then turned away. Her inheritance wasn't waiting in that chapel among the bones of slaveholders. It was being forged in a stable, in secret meetings and dangerous plans, in the simple act of recognizing another person's humanity. Freedom, she was learning, was the only inheritance worth keeping, and she would fight for it, even if it cost her everything. The days collapsed into each other with terrifying speed. Clara moved through the big house like a ghost, playing her role perfectly while her mind spun with logistics and fear. Every time her father looked at her across the breakfast table, she wondered if he could see the treason written on her face. But Colonel Whitlock saw only what he'd always seen, a decorative daughter, slightly odd perhaps, but ultimately harmless. On Thursday evening, 2 days before Hannah's scheduled auction, Clara stood in her father's study while he reviewed cotton futures. The room smelled of cigar smoke and leather, of masculine certainty. On the walls hung daguerreotypes of stern-faced Whitlock men, generation after generation of them, all wearing the same expression of righteous dominion. "Father," Clara said carefully, "I've been thinking about the household expenses." The colonel didn't look up from his ledger. "Have you? And what profound economic insights has my daughter developed?" She ignored the condescension. "We're overstocked in the stables. 6 horses for just the 2 of us seems excessive. Perhaps we could sell 2? The older mare and the gelding with the bad hoof?" Now he looked up, suspicious at last. "Why this sudden interest in husbandry?" "Mrs. Pemberton mentioned they're looking for breeding stock. I thought we might make a profit." Clara kept her voice light, bored even, as if this were just another feminine whim. Her father grunted and returned to his papers. "Fine. Have Matthews handle it next week. Now leave me be. This tariff situation is giving me a headache." Clara retreated, her heart pounding. Next week. But the horses would be gone by then, carrying Daniel and Hannah north through the back roads Josiah had mapped out. She'd managed to secure the money too, $20 taken 5 cents at a time from the household accounts over the past 3 days. It wasn't much, but it might buy food, buy silence, buy a chance. That night in the stables, the 4 conspirators finalized their plan. Sunday, they'd decided. While the colonel was in church delivering his weekly lecture on Christian duty, Daniel and Hannah would take the 2 horses and head north. Josiah had secured false traveling papers from his contact in Vicksburg, crude forgeries that would never withstand close inspection, but might buy them time if stopped on country roads. "I should come with you," Josiah said quietly, "to guide you through the first 20 miles at least." Daniel shook his head. "Can't risk it. They'd notice you gone, and then they'd know to look for horses too. Better you stay. Act normal." He clasped Josiah's hand. "You've done enough, brother. More than enough." Hannah sat in the hay, one hand resting on her slight belly. "What about you, Miss Clara? When they figure out the horses are gone, when my husband don't show for morning call?" "I'll say I knew nothing," Clara said, though the lie tasted like ash. "I'll act shocked, horrified, play the delicate white woman who could never imagine such deception happening under her nose. And if they don't believe you?" Clara thought of her father's face when he discovered the truth, the purple rage that would consume him. "Then I'll deal with the consequences." Josiah looked at her with something like grief. "Miss Clara, you understand what you're risking. Your father will disown you. Society will shun you. You could end up with nothing." "I already have nothing," Clara said. "Just things, pretty things in a pretty house built on ugliness. At least this way, I'll have done something real." They sat in silence, the weight of what they were attempting pressing down on them. Outside, cicadas screamed their nightly chorus. The August heat hadn't broken despite the late hour, and sweat ran down Clara's back, soaking into her dress. Hannah began to hum, that same melody Clara had heard so many nights, the river song, the freedom song. One by one, the others joined in, their voices twining together in the lamplight. For a moment, the stable became a church, their conspiracy a prayer, and Clara felt something holy moving through them that had nothing to do with her father's God. Sunday morning arrived wrapped in false innocence. The sky was a flawless blue, and church bells rang across Vicksburg. Clara, dressed in her finest gown, pale green silk with lace at the collar, and descended to breakfast with a serene smile. Her father was already reviewing the sermon he planned to deliver. "I'm preaching on obedience today," he announced. "The natural order God has established. Wives to husbands, children to fathers, servants to masters, everything in its proper place." "How inspiring," Clara murmured, sipping her coffee. Her hands were steady. She'd practiced this moment in her mind 100 times. They rode to church in the carriage, past fields where slaves worked even on Sunday, their labor consecrated by the very institution that should have offered them rest. Clara watched her father wave benevolently to the field hands, accepting their bowed heads as his due. Did he truly not see them as human? Or had he simply trained himself not to look too closely? The church was full, plantation owners and their families, filling the white-painted pews with rustling skirts and self-satisfaction. Reverend Patterson welcomed them with his oil-slick smile, and the service began with hymns about washing in the blood of the Lamb. Clara sang mechanically, her mind with Daniel and Hannah, who by now should be 10 miles north, following the roads Josiah had carefully charted. Her father stood to preach, his voice booming through the small building about divine hierarchy and the curse of Ham, all the comfortable theology that justified bondage. Clara watched him perform, this man she'd once adored, and felt nothing but pity. He was so certain of his righteousness, so convinced that God wore his face and spoke with his voice. "A house divided cannot stand," the colonel intoned. "Order must be maintained. Masters must master, and servants must serve. This is the way of the world, ordained from the foundation of creation." Clara thought of Hannah's hands trembling as she accepted the food basket. She thought of Daniel's desperate eyes. She thought of Josiah teaching her to read between the lines of Scripture, to find the radical love her father's religion had buried beneath rules and regulations. When the sermon ended, the congregation filed out into the blazing noon. Women clustered in their usual groups, gossiping about engagements and household troubles. Men discussed cotton prices and politics. Slaves stood at respectful distances, holding parasols and waiting to serve. Clara played her part perfectly, nodding at Mrs. Pemberton's tedious commentary about the harvest ball, smiling at young men who eyed her with matrimonial speculation. All the while, her mind calculated distances. 20 miles by now, surely. Maybe 25 if the horses were fresh. The afternoon dragged, Clara embroidered by the window, her needle moving in mechanical rhythms while her heart raced. Her father napped in his study, digestion and righteousness lulling him into sleep. The house was quiet, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down minutes that felt like hours. At 5 o'clock, Overseer Matthews pounded on the door. Clara heard her father's heavy footsteps crossing the hall, heard the door open, heard Matthew's voice tight with fury. "2 horses gone, Colonel, and that field hand Daniel didn't report for evening call." The silence that followed was like the moment before lightning strikes, all the air sucked out of the world. Then her father's voice, low and terrible. "Get the dogs, get the patrollers. I want every road between here and Memphis searched, and find out who helped them." Clara set down her embroidery with trembling hands. This was it. The moment she'd known was coming, but somehow still wasn't prepared for. She descended the stairs slowly, deliberately, her green silk dress rustling. Her father stood in the foyer, his face the color of old meat. Matthews was with him, and two other overseers she vaguely recognized. They all turned to look at her, and in their eyes she saw suspicion beginning to crystallize into certainty. "Clara," her father said, his voice deadly calm, "do you know anything about this?" She met his gaze without flinching. This was the moment to lie, to play the innocent daughter shocked by such deception. Instead, she heard herself say, "Only that it took them too long to run." The words hung in the air like cordite smoke. Her father's face transformed, rage and betrayal warring for dominance. "What did you say?" "I said it took them too long. They should have run years ago. They all should have." Matthews took a step forward, but the colonel raised his hand. "Everyone out! Now!" His eyes never left Clara's face. The overseers retreated, and Clara was alone with her father in the foyer. The grandfather clock ticked. Outside, men were already mounting up, preparing to hunt. "You helped them," the colonel said. Not a question, an accusation, a verdict, a sentence. "Yes." He moved fast for a heavy man, his hand connecting with her face hard enough to snap her head sideways. Clara tasted blood, felt her cheek already swelling. But she didn't cry out. She wouldn't give him that. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he hissed. "You've violated every law of God and man. You've betrayed your family, your race, everything we've built. Those people are property, Clara, property that you stole. Those people," Clara said carefully, "are human beings that you enslaved." Her father raised his hand again, and Clara braced herself. But the blow didn't fall. Instead, the colonel seemed to deflate, his face going from red to grey. He pressed his hand to his chest, his breathing suddenly labored. "Father!" He staggered, catching himself against the banister. "You!" he gasped. "You ungrateful!" But whatever curse he'd been forming died on his lips. His eyes went wide, his hand clawed at his chest, and then he was falling, his substantial weight hitting the floor with a sound like judgment. Clara stood frozen, watching her father's face turn purple, watching him gasp like a landed fish. She should call for help. She should scream for Matthews, for a doctor, for someone. But she stood paralyzed, watching the man who'd ruled her entire world dying on his expensive carpet. The colonel's mouth moved, trying to form words. His hand reached toward her, whether in supplication or condemnation she couldn't tell. Then the light went out of his eyes, and he was still. Clara heard herself breathing, harsh and loud in the sudden silence. The grandfather clock ticked. Outside, men shouted orders, dogs barked, the machinery of pursuit rumbling to life. But in the foyer, there was only stillness and the body of a tyrant who'd finally been conquered by the only thing he couldn't control, his own raging heart. She knelt beside him, checking for a pulse she knew she wouldn't find. Her father was dead. The colonel was dead. The master of Whitlock Plantation had fallen not to slave rebellion or northern armies, but to his own fury at being defied by his daughter. Clara stood slowly, her legs unsteady. She should feel something, grief, horror, guilt. Instead, she felt only a strange numbness, as if she were watching herself from a great distance. The front door burst open. Matthews and two other overseers rushed in, then stopped short at the sight of the colonel's body. "What happened?" Matthews demanded. Clara touched her swelling cheek, tasted blood on her lip. "He struck me," she said calmly. "Then he collapsed. His heart, I think." The men stared at her, then at the body, trying to process this sudden shift in the plantation's power structure. The colonel was dead. His daughter, his strange, troublesome daughter, was now sole heir to everything. "You'll continue the search," Clara said, her voice not quite her own. "But you won't harm them if you find them. You'll bring them back safely. Do you understand?" Matthews's jaw worked. "Miss Clara, with all due respect—" "I'm not asking," Clara said. "I'm telling you. My father is dead. This is my plantation now, and things are going to change." She walked past them, past her father's body, up the stairs to her room. Only when she'd closed the door and locked it did she allow herself to shake, to slide down against the wood, to press her hands over her mouth to stifle the sobs that finally came. She'd wanted freedom. She'd wanted change, but not like this. Never like this. Outside, the hunt continued into the gathering dark. Somewhere to the north, Daniel and Hannah rode toward an uncertain future, and in the big house, a daughter sat alone with the consequences of mercy, wondering if salvation ever came without a terrible price. They buried Colonel Edmund Whitlock on a Wednesday, 3 days after his heart betrayed him. The funeral was attended by every prominent family within 50 miles, a parade of black crepe and hollow condolences. They stood in the family chapel, surrounded by generations of Whitlocks mouldering in their expensive tombs, and spoke of what a great man the colonel had been, what a pillar of the community, what a tragic loss. Clara stood at the front pew in borrowed black silk, her face veiled, her bruised cheek hidden. She accepted embraces from women who'd taken tea in her parlor, handshakes from men who'd done business with her father. They told her how sorry they were, how she must be devastated, how difficult this must be for a young woman alone. No one asked about the 2 missing slaves. No one mentioned the horses that had vanished the same night the colonel died. The patrollers had searched for 4 days, ranging as far north as the Tennessee border, but Daniel and Hannah had disappeared into the vast network of safe houses and secret roads that threaded through the South like veins beneath skin. Either they'd made it to freedom, or they'd died trying. Either way, they were gone. Reverend Patterson delivered the eulogy with his usual bombast, painting the colonel as a saint who'd been called home to his heavenly reward. Clara listened from behind her veil and thought about the scars on Moses's back, about Sarah's children sold away, about Ruth's violated daughter. She wondered if heaven had a place for men like her father, or if judgment took a different form than the Reverend imagined. After the service, the mourners returned to the big house for refreshments. Clara moved through them like a somnambulist, accepting their sympathies, pouring their tea, playing the grieving daughter. Mrs. Pemberton cornered her near the parlor window. "You poor dear," the woman cooed, her eyes avid behind the sympathy. Alone now, and with such a responsibility. The plantation, the slaves, all those complicated financial matters. "Perhaps you should consider selling. I know several families who'd be interested in the property." Clara looked at her levelly. "I have no intention of selling. But my dear, a woman can't possibly manage such an enterprise alone. It's simply not done. You'll need a husband, someone to—" "I'll manage perfectly well," Clara interrupted. "Thank you for your concern." She excused herself and retreated upstairs, unable to bear another moment of false mourning. In her father's study, her study now, she supposed, she closed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. The room was exactly as he'd left it. Ledgers on the desk, maps on the walls, that awful daguerreotype of stern Whitlock men glaring down at her. The iron box sat in the corner, now legally hers, containing money earned from stolen labor. Clara crossed to the desk and opened the leather-bound ledger, page after page of her father's careful script. Names, ages, prices. Human beings reduced to accounting. She found Hannah's entry. Female 22, field hand, sickly disposition, sold to Matthews Trading Company Natchez for $400. Except Hannah hadn't been sold. She was free now, or dead, but either way, no longer property. Clara took up her father's pen and drew a careful line through the entry. Then another. And another. She worked methodically, crossing out each name, each price, each casual notation of ownership. It took hours. By the time she finished, her hand cramped and ink stained her fingers. The ledger looked like a battlefield. black lines obliterating her father's careful records. When it was done, she sat back and stared at the ruined book. This was her inheritance, pages of cancelled debts, a plantation built on bones, and the crushing weight of deciding what came next. A knock at the door made her start. "Miss Clara?" Josiah's voice, carefully respectful. "May I come in?" She'd barely seen him since her father's death. He'd been questioned by Matthews about the missing slaves, but with the colonel dead, the overseer's authority was suddenly uncertain. Josiah had sworn ignorance, and without direct proof, Matthews had been forced to let it go. "Come in," Clara said. Josiah entered, his hat in his hands. He'd dressed in his best clothes for the funeral, still shabby by white standards, but clean and dignified. He looked at Clara behind her father's desk, then at the ruined ledger, and something like understanding crossed his face. "The house is finally empty," he said. "Thought you should know." Clara nodded. The last mourners had departed at sunset, leaving her alone with servants and slaves who weren't quite sure what to make of their new mistress. "Josiah," she said abruptly, "I need your help." He stiffened slightly. Help could mean anything. Could be a trap, could be another white person expecting labor without compensation. "With what, miss?" "Running this place, not the way my father did, but differently." She gestured at the ledger. "I can't keep people in bondage. I won't, but I also can't just throw open the gates and expect everyone to survive. Most of them have nowhere to go, no money, no—" Her voice broke. "I don't know what I'm doing, Josiah. I don't know how to fix this." Josiah was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the last light drained from the sky, leaving the study in shadow. Finally he spoke. "There's no fixing it, Miss Clara. Not really. 400 years of sin doesn't wash away because one white girl has a crisis of conscience." The words stung, but Clara nodded. "I know, but I have to try something, and I can't do it alone." "Why me?" "Because you're the smartest person on this plantation. Because you taught me to see what I'd been blind to my whole life. Because—" She met his eyes. "Because I trust you." Josiah shook his head slowly. "Trust is a dangerous thing between white and black in Mississippi, miss. Dangerous for both of us." "I know, but I'm asking anyway." He studied her face, the bruise fading on her cheek, the exhaustion in her eyes, the determination that had emerged from the wreckage of her father's world. Finally, he set his hat on the desk. "All right," he said, "but we do this my way. No more secrets, no more sneaking around. If we're going to change things, we do it openly. Damn the consequences." "Damn the consequences," Clara repeated, and felt something like hope stirring in her chest. They worked through the night, planning. Josiah brought maps and documents he'd been secretly compiling for years, records of slave purchases, sales, separations. Together, they cross-referenced them with her father's ledgers, trying to piece together families that had been torn apart. "Sarah's children," Josiah said, pointing to an entry from 1847, "sold to a plantation in Georgia. She hasn't seen them in 4 years. Can we find them? Buy them back?" "Maybe. If they're still alive. If the current owner will sell. It'll take money, time, connections we don't have." Clara thought of the iron box, the money inside. Blood money, but perhaps it could be redeemed. "We'll find a way." As dawn broke, they'd compiled a list of immediate priorities: reuniting separated families, securing legal documentation for freedmen, establishing paid work arrangements for those who chose to stay. It was overwhelming, probably impossible, and almost certainly illegal under current Mississippi law. "They'll fight us," Josiah said. "Matthews, the overseers, the other plantations. They'll see this as a threat to the whole system." "Let them fight," Clara said with more confidence than she felt. "I'm a white woman, a property owner. That gives me power in this sick society. I might as well use it for something good." Josiah looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You understand you're making yourself an outcast. Everything you've known, Everyone you've grown up with, they'll turn on you. They already have, Clara said, thinking of Mrs. Pemberton's calculating eyes, of the whispers she'd heard at the funeral. The Colonel's odd daughter, they said, always was strange. Now, unprotected, vulnerable, possibly mad with grief. I'd rather be an outcast than a slave owner. Over the following weeks, Clara began implementing changes. She gathered the slaves in front of the big house and explained her intentions. Those who wished to leave could go, with money and supplies for the journey. Those who chose to stay would be paid for their labor, modest wages, but wages nonetheless. And she would work to reunite families torn apart by her father's greed. The response was skeptical. Freedom offered by a white woman who still legally owned them. Promises of payment when promises had always been lies. Most chose to wait to see if this was real or just another form of cruelty. But Clara persisted. She drew up contracts, paid wages from her father's money, began correspondence with plantations across the South, seeking to purchase and free separated family members. She moved Josiah from the stables to the main house, making him, scandalously, her business partner. The overseers quit in protest. Half the house slaves fled, certain some terrible punishment was coming, and the neighbors noticed. Mrs. Pemberton arrived one October morning, her face tight with disapproval. "Clara, dear, we need to talk about these changes you're making." They sat in the parlor where they'd once discussed embroidery and engagements. Now they discussed revolution. "You're causing problems," Mrs. Pemberton said bluntly. "Paying slaves, treating that man Josiah as an equal. The other plantations are concerned, very concerned. This kind of behavior spreads. You're setting a dangerous precedent." "Dangerous to whom?" Clara asked. "To all of us. The natural order," Clara interrupted, "is whatever we decide it is. And I've decided my father's order was wrong." Mrs. Pemberton stood, her face flushed. "You'll regret this, child. Mark my words. You'll end up alone, penniless and shunned. And for what? For slaves who will rob you blind the moment your back is turned?" After she left, Clara stood at the window watching her carriage retreat down the drive. The October air was finally cool, the oppressive summer heat broken at last. The cotton fields lay fallow. She'd told the workers they'd plant food crops in the spring instead, something to feed themselves rather than enrich merchants. Behind her she heard Josiah enter. "That went well," he said dryly. Clara laughed, surprising herself. "I'm burning every bridge my father built." "Good. They were bridges to hell anyway." She turned to face him. "Are we insane, Josiah, trying to change the unchangeable?" "Probably," he said, "but insanity might be the only sane response to this world." He handed her a letter that had arrived with the Morning Post from Tennessee, about Sarah's children. Clara opened it with shaking hands. She read quickly, then looked up with tears in her eyes. "They're alive, both of them. The owner will sell for $800. It was an enormous sum, nearly half what remained in her father's iron box. But Josiah was already nodding. "Do it. Send the money. Bring them home." Home. The word caught in Clara's throat. Was Whitlock Plantation home now? Could a place built on suffering ever be redeemed? Or were they just building new dreams on old graves? She didn't know, but she signed the draft for $800 and sent it north with the Evening Post. And that night, for the first time since her father's death, she slept without nightmares. Outside, autumn deepened into early winter. The fields rested, preparing for transformation, and in the big house, by lamplight, two people bent over ledgers and correspondence, trying to calculate the mathematics of freedom. It was impossible work, probably futile work, but it was the only work worth doing. And in the family chapel, where Colonel Edmund Whitlock lay in his expensive tomb, the dead kept their silence. Their judgment, if it existed, would have to wait for a higher court than any Mississippi could provide. Winter came to Mississippi with uncharacteristic ferocity. Ice glazed the magnolia trees, and frost killed the last of the autumn flowers. Inside the big house, Clara and Josiah worked by firelight, their breath misting in rooms that had never been properly insulated. The colonel had believed warmth was earned, and that slaves should be grateful for whatever shelter they received. Now the chill cut through everyone equally, a democratic misery. In December, Sarah's children arrived. Clara and Josiah rowed to meet the riverboat in Vicksburg, watching the gangplank with anxious eyes. When two thin figures emerged, a girl of 12 and a boy of 9, Clara felt her throat tighten. They were so small, so fragile-looking after 4 years of separation from their mother. Sarah was waiting at the plantation gates. Clara would remember that reunion for the rest of her life. The way Sarah's legs buckled, the way she gathered her children into her arms and wept so hard no sound emerged. The way the boy, who probably didn't even remember his mother's face, clung to her anyway, some deep recognition moving through him. "Thank you," Sarah whispered to Clara later, her eyes red and swollen. "Thank you, miss. I never hoped." "It's not enough," Clara said. "It will never be enough. But it's something." The plantation slowly transformed. Moses, the old man with the scarred back, became the de facto leader among the workers. He'd seen too much to trust white promises easily, but he gave Clara grudging respect when she paid wages on time and kept her word about no more whippings. Ruth's daughter, who'd been so violated, began to smile again when Clara hired a teacher from Vicksburg. A freed woman named Julia, who taught letters and numbers in the old overseer's cottage. But transformation had a price. The neighboring plantations organized. In January, a delegation of landowners arrived unannounced: Colonel Morrison, Judge Blackwell, and Mr. Hendricks, along with several others. Clara received them in the parlor, with Josiah standing beside her, a deliberate provocation that made their faces harden. "Miss Whitlock," Colonel Morrison began, his voice heavy with false courtesy, "we've come to express our concerns about your management practices." My practices?" Clara kept her voice level. "You mean paying people for their labor?" "We mean treating slaves as if they were equals," Judge Blackwell cut in. His face was florid, angry. "Letting them learn to read, for God's sake. Consulting with them on business matters." He glared at Josiah. "Elevating one of them to a position of authority over white men." "There are no white men working here anymore," Clara said. "Your overseers quit because they couldn't stomach the idea of treating human beings with dignity." "Listen to her," Mr. Hendricks said with disgust. "Spouting abolitionist nonsense. Your father would be ashamed." "My father," Clara said carefully, "died of rage when his daughter dared to think for herself. I consider that a moral failing on his part, not mine." The room went silent. Mentioning the colonel's death was a tactical error. She saw it immediately in their faces. Whispers had circulated about that night, about the missing slaves and the colonel's heart attack. Some suspected, some knew, but saying it aloud made it real. "You're dangerous," Morrison said flatly. "An infection that could spread. Other slaves are already asking questions, making demands. You're destabilizing the entire county." "Good," Clara said. "It needs destabilizing." Judge Blackwell stood, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "You have 1 month to reverse these changes. Return to proper plantation management, or we'll have you declared incompetent. Your property will be seized, sold to someone who understands their Christian duty." "On what grounds?" Josiah asked. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. The judge turned to him, fury and disgust warring on his face. "You dare address your betters?" "I'm addressing men who profit from evil and call it righteousness," Josiah said. "That doesn't make you my betters, just my enemies." Morrison's hand dropped to where a weapon might rest. For a moment, Clara thought violence would erupt right there in her parlor. Then the judge grabbed Morrison's arm. 1 month, Blackwell repeated. "Choose wisely, Miss Whitlock." They left in a flurry of cold wind and colder promises. When the door closed, Clara found herself shaking. "They'll do it," she said. "They'll find a judge, a doctor willing to testify I'm hysterical or mad. They'll take everything." Josiah was quiet, staring at the fire. "Then we move faster. Whatever we can do in the next month, we do it. Free as many as we can. Document everything. Make it legally bulletproof." "It's Mississippi," Clara said bitterly. "Nothing's bulletproof against white men protecting their interests." "Then we make them fight for it. Make it costly, public, impossible to ignore." He turned to her, his eyes fierce. "You wanted to burn it all down, Miss Clara. Well, the flames are coming. Question is whether we're ready." They worked with desperate intensity over the following weeks. Clara signed manumission papers for every person on the plantation, though she knew Mississippi law would likely invalidate them. She transferred property deeds to Josiah, making him legal co-owner, despite laws prohibiting free blacks from owning land. She wrote letters to abolitionist newspapers in the North, documenting everything, and she waited for the reckoning. It came on a February morning, cold and clear. A carriage arrived bearing Judge Blackwell, a doctor Clara had never met, and the county sheriff. Behind them rode a dozen men, armed and grim-faced. "Miss Whitlock," the sheriff said, dismounting, "I have a warrant for your detention. You've been declared mentally unfit to manage your affairs." Clara stood on the veranda, Josiah beside her. Behind them, gathered in the yard, were 50 people who'd once been her father's slaves. They weren't armed. Clara had forbidden it, knowing that violence would only give the authorities an excuse. But they were there, watching, witnessing. "On what basis?" Clara demanded. The doctor stepped forward, a thin man with calculating eyes. "I've reviewed your case, Miss Whitlock. The trauma of your father's death, combined with the strain of managing a plantation alone, has clearly affected your mental faculties. You need rest, treatment, proper supervision." "I need," Clara said loudly, "to not be imprisoned for the crime of treating people like human beings." "You're not being imprisoned," Judge Blackwell said. "Just relocated. For your own good. The plantation will be managed by a court-appointed administrator until you recover, meaning you'll reverse everything I've done, meaning we'll restore order." Clara felt Josiah's hand on her arm, a warning. She saw Moses in the crowd, his scarred back straight, his old eyes fierce. She saw Sarah holding her reunited children. She saw Ruth's daughter, who'd learned to smile again. "No," Clara said simply. The sheriff's hand moved to his weapon. "Miss Whitlock, don't make this difficult. I'm already making it difficult. I refuse to be detained. I refuse to surrender my property, and I'm not leaving this veranda." The armed men shifted, unsure. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. The mad white woman was supposed to weep and submit, not stand defiant with a black man beside her and 50 freed slaves watching. "You're in violation of a court order," Blackwell said, his voice hardening. "I'm in violation of unjust laws," Clara shot back, "which is different." "Remove her," the judge ordered. 2 men started forward, but before they could reach the veranda, Moses stepped in front of them. He didn't raise a hand, didn't threaten. Just stood there, his presence a statement. Sarah joined him, then Ruth, then Julia the teacher and the children she'd been instructing. One by one, the freed slaves formed a barrier between Clara and the sheriff's men. "Stand aside," the sheriff ordered. "This is official business." "This is injustice," Moses said quietly, "and we've had enough of it." For a long moment, the 2 groups faced each other in the cold February air. The sheriff's men were armed, the freed slaves were not. But they had something else, the terrible clarity of people who'd already lost everything and discovered they could still choose to stand. "You'll regret this," Judge Blackwell said to Clara. "All of you will." "I already regret everything," Clara said. "I regret 22 years of being blind. I regret every day I didn't question, didn't challenge, didn't see. But I don't regret this moment. Whatever happens next, I don't regret standing here." The judge turned to the sheriff. Clear them. Use force if necessary. The sheriff looked at his men, then at the crowd of freed slaves, then back at the judge. Clara saw the calculation in his eyes. This could turn into a bloodbath. A massacre on the steps of the Whitlock plantation would draw attention they didn't want. Northern newspapers would seize on it. Abolitionists would use it as propaganda. "Maybe we should reconsider," the sheriff said slowly. "Get more men, do this proper." "Are you refusing a court order?" Blackwell demanded. "I'm suggesting we approach this strategically, Your Honor. Storming the place with guns might not play well in the papers." Clara felt a flicker of hope. The sheriff was corrupt, certainly, but he was also pragmatic. And right now, practicality suggested avoiding a public spectacle. The judge and the doctor conferred in low voices. Finally, Blackwell turned back to Clara. "This isn't over. We'll return with federal marshals if necessary. You cannot defy the law indefinitely." "Watch me," Clara said. They left, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. When the carriage disappeared down the drive, Clara's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the veranda steps, her whole body shaking. Moses approached slowly. "Miss Clara, they'll be back, and next time they'll bring enough men that we can't stop them." "I know." "So, what do we do?" Clara looked up at the old man with the scarred back, at Sarah holding her children, at Josiah standing beside her like a sentinel. She thought about her father's tomb in the family chapel, about all the Whitlocks who'd built their fortune on bondage and called it civilization. "We fight," she said, "and if we lose, we make sure the whole country knows why." That evening, Clara sat in her father's study, and wrote letters to newspapers in Boston and New York, to abolitionist societies, to anyone who might care that in Mississippi a woman was being declared insane for the crime of treating people as human. She wrote until her hand cramped, until the lamp oil ran low, until Josiah came to tell her she needed rest. But she couldn't rest, because she knew what was coming. The storm was gathering. The old order was marshalling its forces, and Clara Whitlock, daughter of a tyrant, stood at the center of it all, trying to hold back the tide with nothing but her refusal to accept that cruelty was inevitable. Outside, winter wind howled through the empty cotton fields. The soil lay fallow, resting, waiting for spring. And in the big house, by failing lamplight, a woman and a man plotted revolution with nothing but words and stubborn hope. It wasn't enough. They both knew it wasn't enough, but it was all they had. Spring came reluctantly to Whitlock Plantation, as if even the seasons were uncertain what to make of the transformation taking place there. Clara stood at the edge of the fallow cotton fields, watching morning mist rise from the dark soil. The earth smelled of possibility and decay, of endings and beginnings tangled together. It had been 3 months since Judge Blackwell's attempt to have her detained. 3 months of legal battles, newspaper articles, and growing attention from abolitionists in the North. Clara's story had become something larger than herself, a symbol of resistance in a South that tolerated no dissent. But symbols, she'd learned, were cold comfort when federal marshals were en route. The letter had arrived yesterday, official and final. The court had upheld Blackwell's ruling. Clara was to be removed from the property within the week and placed in the care of a sanatorium in Mobile. The plantation would be sold to satisfy debts she'd incurred through her reckless mismanagement, though everyone understood the real crime was paying wages instead of wielding whips. Josiah found her there, standing in the empty field. He'd aged in these months, new lines around his eyes, a weariness in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "Lawyers say we're out of options," he said quietly. "They can force the sale, take the property, scatter everyone who's here." Clara nodded. She'd known this was coming. Fighting the entire power structure of Mississippi with nothing but righteousness was always going to be a losing battle. What about the others? Moses, Sarah, the families we reunited. Most want to head north. The Underground Railroad contacts say they can move them in groups, get them to free states. He paused. "I should go with them, help guide them." "And me?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. "You'll be taken to Mobile, locked away until you recover, meaning until you agree to accept their version of reality." His voice was bitter. "I'm sorry, Miss Clara. We tried." "We did more than try," Clara said. "We succeeded, at least partially. 50 people are free who weren't before. Families are together. That matters." "Does it? If it all gets erased the moment we leave?" Clara turned to face him. In the morning light, she could see her father's big house behind them. That monument to stolen wealth, now slated for auction. "Josiah, do you remember what you told me that first night in the stables? About finding small freedoms, moments of dignity?" "I remember. This was our moment. Maybe just a moment, but we had it. We proved it was possible, even if just for a little while, to live differently." She gestured at the fallow fields. "This soil rested this year. No cotton soaked in blood and sweat. That's something." Josiah was quiet for a long time. "You sound like you're saying goodbye." "I'm saying that whatever happens next, we didn't fail. The world failed. But we did what we were supposed to do." Over the next 3 days, they prepared. The freed slaves packed what little they had, making ready for the dangerous journey north. Clara signed over what remained of her money to Josiah, officially illegal, but she didn't care anymore about Mississippi law. She wrote final letters to her abolitionist contacts, documenting everything for the historical record. On the 4th day, Sarah came to the big house. She stood in the foyer where Clara's father had died, her hands twisting nervously. "Miss Clara," she said, "I wanted to, that is, we all wanted to say—" She stopped, overcome. "I know," Clara said gently. "You don't have to say it. But I do. You gave me back my children. Whatever else happens, whatever they do to this place or to you, that can never be taken away. You gave me what I thought I'd lost forever." Clara embraced her, feeling the older woman's thin shoulders shake with emotion. "Take care of them, Sarah. Get north safely. Live free." "What about you? They're going to lock you away." "Let them try to lock away what I've learned," Clara said. "They can imprison my body, but they can't make me unsee what I've seen. Can't make me unknow what I know." That night, the last night before the marshals arrived, Clara stood in the family chapel. Her father's tomb gleamed in the moonlight filtering through stained glass. Generations of Whitlocks surrounded her, their names carved in expensive marble. "I'm ending it," she said aloud to the dead. "Your legacy, your empire, your carefully constructed justifications for cruelty, it ends with me." The tomb offered no response, but Clara felt a strange peace settle over her. She thought about her mother, dead 7 years, and wondered if the woman would understand. Would she have had the courage to do what Clara had done, or would she have chosen the comfortable lie? The easy path of not questioning? Clara would never know. But standing here among the bones of slaveholders, she felt certain of one thing: some inheritances were meant to be destroyed. The marshals arrived at dawn, federal men this time, with authority that superseded even Mississippi's commitment to white supremacy. Clara met them on the veranda, dressed in her simplest dress, carrying only a small bag. "Miss Whitlock," the lead marshal said almost kindly, "we're here to escort you to Mobile." "I understand." Behind her, the big house stood empty. The freed slaves had left in the night, guided by railroad conductors toward whatever future they could forge. Only Josiah remained, standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. As Clara descended the steps, Judge Blackwell's carriage pulled up. The judge emerged, satisfaction written across his face. "A sad day," he said with false sympathy, "but necessary. You'll receive excellent care in Mobile, Miss Whitlock. Perhaps in time you'll come to understand that we acted in your best interest." "I understand perfectly," Clara said. "You're terrified. Terrified that if one white woman can question the system, others might follow. terrified that your whole carefully constructed world is built on sand. Blackwell's mask slipped, showing the rage beneath. You've destroyed your father's life's work, ruined a profitable estate. And for what? To play savior to people who'll never appreciate your sacrifice? They already appreciate it, Clara said, which is more than my father ever received from anyone. As the marshals helped her into their carriage, Clara took one last look at Whitlock Plantation. The big house with its white columns, the fallow fields waiting for crops that would never be planted, the family chapel where her father's heart had finally given out. She saw Josiah raise his hand in farewell, and she raised hers in return. Then the carriage lurched forward, carrying her away from everything she'd ever known. The journey to Mobile took 2 days. Clara spent them watching the Mississippi landscape roll past. Other plantations, with their white big houses and distant slave quarters, small towns where the entire economy ran on bondage, rivers that had carried countless people in chains toward markets where they'd be sold like livestock. The sanatorium was a large building on the outskirts of Mobile, surrounded by magnolia trees and iron gates. It looked peaceful, almost pastoral. Clara knew better. Places like this were where inconvenient women disappeared. Wives who questioned their husbands, daughters who refused to marry, anyone who threatened the social order by thinking for themselves. Dr. Ashford, the director, greeted her with clinical detachment. "Miss Whitlock, I've reviewed your case file. Quite remarkable the delusions you've suffered, but we specialize in treating such afflictions." "My only delusion," Clara said, "was believing I could change an entire society. That wasn't madness, just optimism." "We'll see," Dr. Ashford said. "With time and proper treatment, I'm confident we can restore you to a more conventional frame of mind." Clara's room was small but clean, with a single window overlooking the grounds. They took her bag, gave her institutional clothing, explained the rules. She listened with half an ear, her mind still on the plantation, wondering if Josiah and the others had made it safely north. The days blurred together. Treatments designed to correct her thinking, cold baths, isolation, lectures from doctors who explained patiently that her belief in equality was a symptom of hysteria. Clara endured it all with a strange calm. They could control her body, but her mind remained her own. She thought often of that last night in the stables, reading by lantern light with Josiah. The way words had opened worlds, the way ideas had become more dangerous than weapons. They could lock her away, but they couldn't make her forget that feeling of understanding, of seeing clearly for the first time. Months passed. Summer turned to autumn. Clara marked time by the changing leaves outside her window, by the slow rhythm of institutional life. She wrote letters that were never sent, kept a journal the doctors never saw, held on to herself with quiet determination. And then, on a November morning, something changed. Dr. Ashford summoned her to his office, his expression unreadable. "Miss Whitlock, you have a visitor." Clara's heart leapt. Had Josiah come? Had he made it north and found a way back? But the man waiting in the visiting room wasn't Josiah. He was thin, northern-looking, with intelligent eyes behind spectacles. He stood when Clara entered. "Miss Whitlock, my name is Thomas Garrett. I'm an attorney from Philadelphia, and I represent the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society." Clara sat slowly. "I don't understand. Your letters reached us, the ones you wrote before your detention. They've been published in several abolitionist newspapers. Your story has become quite famous in the North." He smiled slightly. "We've been working to secure your release." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that detaining a woman for freeing her slaves is exactly the kind of tyranny our nation claims to oppose. We've filed habeas corpus, brought pressure through political channels, made this an embarrassment Mississippi can't ignore." He leaned forward. "Miss Whitlock, you're going to be released. The news didn't quite penetrate at first. Released. Free." After months of captivity, of treatments designed to break her will, she was going to walk out of this place. "When?" she whispered. "Within the week. There are conditions. You can't return to Mississippi, can't attempt to reclaim the plantation, but you'll be free to live in the North, to tell your story publicly if you choose. Clara thought of the big house, now owned by someone else. The fallow fields probably planted with cotton again. Her father's tomb in the family chapel, surrounded by generations of Whitlocks who'd built their fortune on bondage. "I don't want to go back," she said. "That inheritance was always rotten. Better to let it decay." Garrett smiled. "I thought you might say that. We've arranged lodging for you in Philadelphia and several speaking engagements if you're interested. The abolitionist movement could use voices like yours, white Southerners willing to testify to the truth." The week passed in a blur of paperwork and preparations. When Clara finally walked out of the sanatorium, autumn sunlight on her face, she felt like someone waking from a long, dark dream. The journey north was the inverse of her journey south, passing through the same landscapes, but this time moving toward freedom rather than captivity. She watched the Mason-Dixon line approach with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief at leaving the South behind, sorrow for all those still trapped within its boundaries. Philadelphia welcomed her warily at first. She was a curiosity, a white Southern woman who'd chosen slaves over society, freedom over family legacy. But as she began to speak publicly, telling her story to packed lecture halls, something shifted. People listened. They heard in her words both testimony and warning. "This is what slavery does," she told them. "It corrupts everyone it touches, enslaving masters as surely as it enslaves the enslaved." On a cold December evening, as Clara prepared for another speech, there was a knock at her boarding house door. She opened it to find a familiar face. "Josiah," she breathed. He looked different, better fed, better dressed, but with the same intelligent eyes she remembered. "Miss Clara. Or should I say Mrs. Clara, nobody in particular, since you seem to have shed the Whitlock name." She laughed, surprising herself. "How did you find me?" "Saw your name in the papers. Thought I'd come see if the legendary Clara Whitlock was real or just northern propaganda." He grew serious. "We made it. All of us. Sarah and her children are in Boston. Moses is in upstate New York, working his own land. Ruth's daughter is learning to be a teacher." Clara felt tears streaming down her face. "And you?" "I'm here. In Philadelphia, studying law, actually. Figure someone needs to fight these battles in court, as well as in the fields." He paused. "I wanted to thank you for everything." "I should thank you," Clara said. "You taught me to see. That's a greater gift than freedom." They stood in the doorway, and Clara felt something shift in the air between them. Not romance exactly, too much history, too much pain for anything that simple. But partnership, perhaps. The recognition that they'd survived something together and emerged, changed. "The plantation sold," Josiah said. "New owner is running it the old way, whips and chains and all the rest." Clara nodded. She'd known that would happen. "Some battles we lose, but some we win. And we did win something, Clara. We proved it was possible to live differently, even if just for a moment. That moment will ripple forward. Others will remember." That night, Clara delivered her speech to a packed hall in Philadelphia. She told them about her father's death, about freeing the slaves, about the cost of conscience. She described the fallow fields and the reunited families, the small freedoms carved out of an unjust world. "I can't go home," she concluded. "But I'm not sure I ever had a home worth returning to. My inheritance was built on suffering, and I chose to destroy it rather than perpetuate it. Some might call that madness. I call it the only sane response to an insane world." The applause was thunderous, but Clara barely heard it. In her mind, she was standing at the edge of those empty cotton fields, wind sweeping through the rows where blood-soaked crops had once grown. She was signing manumission papers by lamplight. She was watching Sarah embrace her children. She was standing with Josiah against armed men, choosing resistance over submission. Those moments couldn't be taken away. No sanatorium, no court order, no southern fury could erase what they'd briefly built together. The world had crushed their experiment, but the fact that it had existed at all mattered. Freedom, Clara had learned, wasn't just about legal status or physical liberation. It was about the moment when you chose truth over comfort, when you valued human dignity over social acceptance, when you burned your inheritance rather than perpetuate its cruelty. Years later, long after the Civil War had torn the South apart and rebuilt it, Clara would return to Mississippi one final time. The plantation had changed hands several times, and the big house stood empty, windows broken, columns crumbling. The family chapel had collapsed, her father's tomb exposed to the elements. She walked the overgrown fields alone, listening to wind sweep through the empty rows. If she closed her eyes, she could almost hear voices. Sarah singing in the quarters, Moses teaching the young ones, Josiah reading by lantern light. Ghosts of a brief moment when things had been different. Freedom was always the only inheritance worth keeping, she whispered to the wind. And the wind, sweeping through those empty rows where cotton no longer grew, seemed to carry her words away. North toward the future, away from the past, toward a world still being born in blood and hope and terrible, necessary change. The Whitlock name died with Clara, childless and unremembered by those who valued such legacies. But the moment she'd created, that brief autumn when a plantation ran on wages instead of whips, when families stayed together, when dignity trumped profit, that moment lived on in stories told around fires, in testimonies recorded for history, in the slow, grinding work of making a more just world. Some nights, people still swear they hear her voice near the old chapel ruins, whispering to the ghosts, "Freedom was always the only inheritance worth keeping." And the ghosts, freed at last from the tyranny of Whitlock ambition, finally rest in peace.